Hey guys, Hamsterwheel here with a new video, and today I would like to delve into some data that I checked out on Warcraft logs. You see, before Wrath Classic launched, there was a lot of talk about which classes would be S-tier DPS and which classes would do horribly. Would Fury Warrior fall flat on its ass right from the get-go and only shine in the later stage of the game, or is it actually not that bad? Well, let's find out. So before we check out the data, here is mostly what the DPS tier list for Phase 1 of Wrath Lich King Classic looks like. Some people might disagree here and there, but this is the general consensus of the player base, and one that, based on the many classes that I played on Wrath Lich King private servers, I thought was pretty darn accurate. So the classes that should dominate the DPS meters in Naxxramas should be both Affliction and Demonology Warlocks, Arcane Mages, Frost DKs, Assassination Rogues, Enhancement Shamans, and Feral Druids, right? Well, let's have a look at a few boss fights in Naxxramas. Starting off with Patchwork, which is a pretty straightforward tank and spank fight where the DPS can pretty much go all out with barely any movement or tons of ads to worry about. And well, the logs are actually fairly similar to the average tier list that sprung up before the release. We see Demonology and Affliction leading the pack, which were indeed predicted to be S-tier DPS. Then in third we have Assassination Rogues, also a pretty good prediction based on the tier list. Afterwards we have Enhancement Shamans, and yes, that was also expected to be an S-tier DPS early on. Now after that, which I find to be pretty interesting, is that Destruction Warlocks did really well on Patchwork. Now Destruction is often seen more as the PvP oriented spec, but it turns out that it can definitely slap in PvE as well. Funny, because this is considered a D-tier DPS, but let's see how well they perform on other fights. In position 6 and 7 we have Arcane Mages and Unholy DKs. Arcane Mages were expected to be S-tier DPS, so once again the list is fairly accurate. They're not on top, but they're not too far off. Another thing worth noting is that people expected Frost to be S-tier and Unholy A-tier, yet here we are with Unholy doing more DPS, and when it comes to top DPS, they're actually second right after Demonology Warlocks. And well, as suspected, the Fury Warriors did very poorly, placing third to last with Arms and Gladiator, that is Protection, being the last two spots. Before Wrath Classic and on Wrath private servers, it was well known that things like Retribution Paladins and Fury Warriors are not good early on and would only shine later on in things like ICC, and these logs definitely reflect that notion. So I could talk all day about more of this, but generally the tier list so far is pretty accurate. But let's go to a more AoE oriented fight, Noth the Plaguebringer. So this is the data so far that we have on Noth, and again, the top 3 exists out of Demonology Warlocks and Assassination Rogues. So yeah, it is a really good time to be a Warlock, and even in a more AoE oriented fight, the Destruction Warlock, which again is considered a D-tier DPS, did really well. And high up there once again are Enhancement Shamans, Arcane Mages, and the Unholy Death Knights. The bottom is once again filled with Warriors, Subtlety Rogues, Retribution Paladins, and Frost Mages. Now let's have a look at one more fight, and then I want to focus on how things have changed from TBC to Wrath of the Lich King. So here's the last fight, Kel'Thuzad, which has two phases where first you focus on ads, and then you focus mostly on the boss. And well, once again, Demonology Warlocks, Affliction Warlocks, and Assassination Rogues are in the top 3. And once again, the underdog and the one that probably surprised some people, Destruction as number 4. Oh yeah, a lot of purple on top of the logs when you look at the fights. Also, we have Survival poking through and claiming the number 5 spot on this fight, and so far the tier list is once again fairly accurate, with Survival being the top pick for Hunters, for Naxxramas, whereas Beast Mastery is the worst spec of them all for PvE. And again, at the bottom we have all 3 Warrior specs, our Frost Mages, Subtlety Rogues, and Retribution Paladins. Also funny to see here that none of the Mage specs scored really well here, with even Arcane being kind of below average. Also, Shadow Priest here did a lot better than the previous 2 fights, so that's kind of interesting to see. So then, how much has the top DPS changed going from Phase 5 TBC to Phase 1 Wrath of the Lich King? Well, here's an overall look first of all boss fights in Naxxramas. Our top 5 is as followed. Number 1, the Demonology Warlock. Number 2, the Assassination Rogue. Number 3, Affliction Warlock. Number 4, Unholy Death Knight. And number 5, the Enhancement Shaman. However, the average data of all bosses in Sunwell Plateau show a very different picture. Warlocks are still on top, so not much has changed, though it was Destruction that reigned supreme at number 1, and Fury Warriors are number 2. So you can see just how much Fury Warriors have fallen off from being a number 2 DPS in the last raid in TBC to now one of the worst DPSers in Naxxramas. But as I said before, Fury Warriors will no doubt shine in the later stages of Wrath Classic. Number 3 goes to the Demonology Warlock, so a very strong pick in late TBC and in early Wrath. So if you played a Demonology Warlock in TBC and now you also play one in Wrath Lich King, you're probably having a field day. Number 4 is ironically the Beast Mastery Hunter, so the Hunter spec that looked like the most potent in late TBC has also fallen off hard and is now not even considered a viable raid spec anymore, and we have Combat Rogue in 5. And overall, Combat Rogues are not doing that bad in Naxxramas, but it's clear that Assassination is the way to go for the best DPS in Naxxramas. Another thing I would like to point out as a sucker for the Boomy class is that balanced druids, on average, are doing better than TBC, but on all fights they scored kind of in the middle. So nothing super amazing, but definitely a lot better in TBC and a whole lot better than in Classic Vanilla. So with all this data being shown, I would just like to say that you should take this with a pretty big grain of salt. It's fun to see the logs and see which classes did better, and it's fun to see how well this data reflects the DPS tier lists. But this data is of course driven by people. For instance, Feral Druid is a very potent spec in Wrath, but its rotation is much more complex than, let's say, an Arcane Mage. So if most of the people who play Feral DPS aren't actually good at nailing that rotation, then it might seem that Feral itself is pretty bad, but in reality it's just a very tricky spec to play. And of course most of the sweaty tryhard people who want to have the highest DPS parses probably moved over to a class or spec that was predicted to be an S tier in Naxxramas. So for instance, someone who might have played a Fury Warrior in late TBC because they love the competitive nature in terms of dealing damage, might have made the switch to, let's say, a Demonology Warlock. So yeah, lots of factors that influence this data, but I thought it was just fun to check this out and see if those tier lists actually hold up. And as a matter of fact, they do quite well. Oh, and quick shout out to Ruggs, by the way. His tier list was one that I liked a lot, and one that I was quote unquote rooting for, so go subscribe to him if you haven't already. And well, thank you for watching this video. Perhaps I'll do this again later down the line to see how the DPS of all the classes change as we go through the phases. For now though, I want to thank you for checking this out. I'm HamsterWheel and have a good one.